The room smelled of expensive cigars, aged whiskey, and quiet desperation. Dim golden light flickered from crystal chandeliers, casting long shadows over the gathered elite. Their murmurs hummed beneath the auctioneer's crisp announcements, each name and number another life exchanged for wealth. Ivy Calloway stood in the center of the stage, her heart pounding so hard she thought they might hear it. The velvet rope around her wrists itched against her skin, a final symbol of her powerlessness. She had never imagined her life would come to this. The night had begun with the others, girls dressed in silken gowns, their faces masked by carefully applied makeup and fake confidence. Some had resigned themselves to their fates. Others trembled. Ivy was neither. She was numb, standing still while her mind raced. The auctioneer's voice cut through the murmurs. Lot 17. Ivy Calloway, 19 years old. Pure lineage. A fine addition to any collection. The bile rose in her throat. A collection? Was that what they called it? The bidding started. Numbers were thrown across the room like a game Ivy wanted no part of. Each number was a heavier weight on her chest. Each raised hand another nail in the coffin of her freedom. Then a voice cut through the crowd. Deep, controlled, final. 5 million. Silence fell. Even the auctioneer hesitated. The man at the back of the room was unlike the others. Where the rest of the bidders smirked and whispered, he remained still, dressed in black, with sharp features and cold, assessing eyes. He looked as if he didn't belong there. Or perhaps the room itself was afraid of him. Silas Blackwood. The name swept through the audience in hushed voices. The billionaire, the recluse, the ghost of the corporate world. He was known for his fortune, his silence, and the rumors that clung to his name like smoke. No one outbid him. No one dared. The gavel struck. Sold. A sharp chill ran down Ivy's spine. A moment later, 2 men approached, untying the velvet rope around her wrists and guiding her toward him. But Silas Blackwood did not rise to greet her. He simply turned, his movement fluid, precise, an order given without words. She was expected to follow. Ivy wanted to fight, scream, run. But as her feet moved forward, she felt the weight of reality settle over her. There was no escape. Not now. The night air outside was cruel against her skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the auction hall. A sleek black car waited at the curb. Silas stood beside it, his expression unreadable as he held the door open. Their eyes met for the first time. There was no pity in his gaze, no lust, no amusement. He studied her as one would examine an unread book, curious but detached. Get in. His voice was low, like the warning growl of a storm before it breaks. Ivy hesitated, but a glance over her shoulder reminded her there was nowhere else to go. The door of the auction house loomed behind her, filled with monsters dressed in silk and power. She slipped into the car, her pulse drumming in her ears. Silas followed, closing the door with a quiet click. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the auction house behind. Ivy watched as the lights faded into the darkness, knowing that whatever lay ahead was just as unknown, and perhaps just as dangerous. The drive stretched into the night, the black car slicing through the darkness like a silent predator. Ivy sat stiffly in the back seat, her body humming with unspoken questions. Silas Blackwood barely acknowledged her presence. He hadn't spoken a word since the auction, his attention fixed on the passing landscape. Outside, the city lights faded, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the countryside. The road twisted upward, the temperature dropping as they ascended into the mountains. Thick trees lined the edges of the highway, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. When the car finally slowed, Ivy's breath hitched. The Blackwood estate loomed ahead, a towering structure of stone and shadow. Gothic spires jutted against the moonlight, casting jagged silhouettes over the frost-covered grounds. The iron gates groaned open, revealing a long, winding driveway lined with dead leaves and mist curling over the gravel. The mansion itself was a fortress, wrapped in silence so heavy it felt unnatural. The car stopped. Before Ivy could gather her thoughts, the driver stepped out and opened her door. Cold air rushed in, biting against her skin. She hesitated but forced herself to move, her boots crunching against the gravel as she emerged into the night. Silas was already halfway up the steps, his presence as commanding as the house itself. He didn't look back, didn't wait for her. She followed. The doors swung open before she could reach for them. A tall man with graying hair and sharp eyes stood at the threshold, dressed in a perfectly pressed black suit. He looked at Ivy, and for the briefest moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition? Surprise? It was gone in an instant. "Welcome home, Mr. Blackwood." His voice was steady, polite. Then his gaze shifted to Ivy. "And our guest?" Silas barely spared him a glance. "Jonathan, see that she has what she needs." Then, without another word, he disappeared into the house. Ivy clenched her fists. That was it? That was all he had to say? Jonathan studied her with an unreadable expression. "Miss Calloway." The way he said her name sent a strange chill down her spine. She didn't recognize him, but something in his posture, restrained, cautious, made her uneasy. "Come inside," he said finally. "It's late." She hesitated at the doorway. The mansion swallowed the light, its vast corridors stretching into the unknown. It smelled of polished wood and something older, like history buried beneath expensive perfume and dust. The silence was suffocating. Jonathan led her through the halls, his movements precise, almost rehearsed. She passed towering paintings, their gilded frames surrounding portraits of people long dead. Their eyes seemed to follow her, hollow and knowing. "How many people live here?" she asked, her voice too loud in the quiet. Jonathan didn't pause. "Few." The answer offered nothing. Finally, they reached a room at the end of the hall. He opened the door, stepping aside to let her enter. It was surprisingly warm inside. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting golden light over the dark furnishings. The bed was massive, the sheets crisp and untouched. A wardrobe stood against the far wall, and a window overlooked the fog-drenched forest. A gilded cage. Jonathan lingered in the doorway. "If you need anything, ring the bell." Ivy turned to him. "What does he want from me?" Jonathan's expression remained unreadable. Best not to ask questions you don't want answered. And with that, he was gone. Ivy exhaled, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed them against the cool fabric of her dress. The walls seemed to close in around her, the house settling into silence once more. One thing was clear. This place was more than just a home. It was a prison, and she had no idea how deep its shadows ran. The Blackwood estate was more than just a house. It was a mausoleum of unspoken tragedies. Ivy had barely slept. The silence in the mansion was oppressive, wrapping around her like an unseen force. Every creak in the wooden floors, every distant murmur of the wind, sent shivers down her spine. Something about this place felt wrong, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone to return. She wandered the halls in the early morning light, careful to step lightly. The high ceilings and vast corridors only emphasized how small she felt within these walls. As she walked, her fingers brushed against the aged wallpaper, the cold banisters, the locked doors. There were so many of them. Why were they locked? What was hidden behind them? The realization crept over her like a shadow. This house held secrets, and so did the man who owned it. From the grand staircase, she spotted Silas standing by the windows in his study, his silhouette carved against the pale morning mist outside. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, controlled. But Ivy saw it. The way his shoulders tensed, the subtle clench of his jaw. He was fighting something. Memories, ghosts, regrets. Whatever it was, it haunted him. Her gaze drifted across the room, landing on a collection of portraits hanging along the far wall. But something was odd. Some of them were turned around, their faces hidden against the wall. She stepped forward. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot. Silas turned sharply. His piercing eyes locked onto her, their depth unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, his voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "What are you doing?" Ivy hesitated. She could lie, pretend she wasn't watching him. But what was the point? Who was Helena Blackwood? She asked instead. A stillness settled over him, thick and heavy. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. something dark, something dangerous. He took a slow step toward her, measured and deliberate. The weight of his presence made the air shift. Ask the wrong questions, and you won't like the answers. His voice was low, calm, but laced with warning. Ivy held her ground. I think I deserve to know why I'm here. Why you bought me. His gaze lingered on her for a beat too long. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. The message was clear. She was a guest in this house, but she was not welcome in his past. But Ivy had never been good at following rules. Ivy found Silas in the study again, his presence as imposing as the dark wood paneling that lined the room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across his face. He stood near the desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand, though he hadn't taken a sip. His gaze was distant, lost in thoughts he refused to share. She didn't care. She was done waiting for answers. I'm not your prisoner, she said, crossing her arms. You don't get to keep me here. Silas didn't look at her immediately. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, as if contemplating her words, before finally meeting her gaze. You're not a prisoner, he said evenly. But you're not leaving. Her pulse quickened. You have no right. I have every right. His voice was like steel, sharp and controlled. He set the glass down with deliberate care. You think you were safer out there? You have no idea what could happen to you if you left. Ivy clenched her fists. Then tell me. Explain why I'm here. Why you? She stopped herself, shaking her head. Why you bought me? Silas took a slow step forward, the weight of his presence sending a shiver down her spine. Because it was the only way to keep you out of their hands. The words hung between them, thick with implication. Ivy searched his face for an answer, but all she saw was the same unreadable expression he always wore. A mask. Whose hands? She demanded. He didn't answer. Frustration boiled inside her. I'm not some helpless girl who needs your protection, Silas. Something flickered in his expression. Amusement? No, something deeper. You're wrong about that, he murmured, his voice quieter now, almost resigned. The tension between them shifted. The fight had started as a battle for control, but now the air between them felt heavier, charged. His eyes darkened as they lingered on her, tracing the defiance in her stance, the determination in her expression. Ivy should have stepped back, should have reminded herself of who he was, what he had done, but she didn't. Neither did he. For a brief, dangerous moment, the space between them seemed too small. A current ran through her veins, the kind that warned her she was playing with fire. Then, as if realizing it at the same time, Silas turned away. Stay out of my way, Ivy. The words were final, but as he left the room, Ivy knew one thing for certain. Whatever this was between them, it was far from over. The moment the hallway fell silent, Ivy moved. She had spent the past day memorizing the layout of the mansion, noting which doors creaked, which corridors remained in darkness even during the day. She didn't know what awaited her beyond the Blackwood estate, but anything was better than the suffocating walls of this house and the man who thought he could control her fate. Her heart pounded as she slipped through the side entrance, the cold night air biting at her skin. The estate stretched wide, its iron gates looming at the end of the long driveway. She ran without hesitation, her breath coming in short bursts. Almost there. Then a voice stopped her. Going somewhere, Miss Calloway? Ivy skidded to a halt, her pulse spiking. Jonathan Greaves stood near the hedges, his hands casually in his pockets, his gaze sharp beneath the dim glow of the estate lamps. She swallowed hard, her fingers curling into fists. I don't belong here, Jonathan sighed, tilting his head slightly. I'd agree. But out there? He nodded toward the wrought iron gates, his voice turning grim. You have no idea what's waiting for you. Ivy's jaw tightened. I'll take my chances. Jonathan exhaled through his nose, almost like he pitied her. I thought you might say that. A slow clap echoed behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Run all you want. Silas's voice was calm, almost amused. The world outside is crueler than me. Ivy forced herself to face him. He stood just beyond the glow of the lights, his presence an unshakable force. The cold wind rustled his dark coat, but his expression remained unreadable. "You don't get to decide what happens to me," she snapped. Silas's lips curved, just slightly. "You think you have a choice?" He took a slow step forward. "Out there, you are unprotected. Prey. People would do worse than keep you in a gilded cage." His voice lowered. "At least I left the door unlocked." Ivy's stomach twisted. "Why do you care?" Something dark passed through his gaze, but just as quickly, it was gone. "I don't." A lie. She knew it. He knew it. But instead of arguing, Silas simply turned and walked back toward the mansion, expecting her to follow. And the worst part? She did. The tension in the Blackwood estate thickened with the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Ivy stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching as Silas faced the man who had taken her freedom, Victor Langley. Everything about him reeked of power and control. His tailored suit, his confident smirk, the way he spoke as if every word was laced with hidden threats. He leaned against the doorway, his fingers tapping against his cane, though Ivy suspected it was more for effect than necessity. "I see you've grown sentimental, Blackwood." Victor's voice was smooth, but there was venom beneath it. "A man like you buying a girl like her? Uncharacteristic." Ivy's stomach twisted. She hated the way he said it, like she was just another transaction. Silas, however, remained unmoved. "You came to my house uninvited. Get to the point." Victor chuckled. "You know why I'm here. There's a debt, and Ivy Calloway is part of it." Ivy's breath hitched. "What debt?" Silas took a slow step forward, his presence suffocating. "Ivy is not your concern." Victor raised an eyebrow. "You think you can keep her? That this arrangement will stand?" His smirk deepened. "You of all people should know, Silas. Debts must always be paid." Silas didn't flinch. His voice, when it came, was ice. "If you think for a second I'll let you take her, try it. See what happens." Something unspoken passed between them. A silent battle of wills. Victor finally exhaled, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "Fine. Have it your way. For now." With a lingering glance at Ivy, he turned and strolled out of the house, leaving an eerie stillness in his wake. That night, Ivy couldn't sleep. Her mind churned with questions, none of which had answers. What debt was Victor talking about? Why had Silas defended her? And why did the thought of him doing so make her chest feel tight? Restless, she wandered the halls. That was when she heard it. A low, broken sound. She followed it to Silas's room, the door slightly ajar. Inside, shadows danced from the dim firelight, casting long, uneven lines across the floor. Silas lay in bed, his breathing uneven, his brow damp with sweat. Then he whispered it. "Helena." Ivy stiffened. The name cut through the quiet like a ghost from the past. Whoever Helena was, she wasn't just a memory. She was a wound. Ivy was done waiting for answers. The shadows of the Blackwood estate stretched long into the evening, but she didn't care about the secrets buried in them. She had spent enough time locked in silence, tiptoeing around the man who held all the answers. If Silas Blackwood thought she would sit still and accept her fate, he had severely underestimated her. So, she started pushing. At breakfast, she spoke just to watch his reaction. "Who's Helena?" she asked, her voice light, almost careless. Silas didn't look up from his coffee. "Leave it." At dinner, she sat across from him, tracing the rim of her glass. "Do I remind you of her?" This time, he did look up. His fingers tightened subtly around his fork, but his voice remained unreadable. "You remind me of nothing, liar." It became a game after that. A dangerous, reckless game where she pressed against his cold indifference just to see if there was something beneath it. One evening, she found him in the study, standing by the grand fireplace, staring into the flames as if they held something only he could see. She lingered in the doorway before stepping inside. "You're not as unreadable as you think," she murmured. Silas sighed, tilting his head slightly, as if contemplating whether she was worth his energy tonight. "You're exhausting, and you're hiding." She took a step closer, watching the way his shoulders tensed. "I think I get under your skin, Silas." The air thickened between them. The fire crackled, its glow casting sharp angles over his face, making the edges of his features look almost too perfect, too harsh. He turned to face her, eyes dark. "You don't get under my skin, Ivy." His voice was quiet, but there was something beneath it, something strained. "You don't matter enough to—" That should have been the end of it. She should have walked away, let him pretend that whatever simmered beneath his carefully controlled surface didn't exist. But she didn't. Instead, she reached out, just slightly, just enough that her fingertips brushed against his. A fleeting touch, barely there. And that was when it happened. Silas moved. Unconsciously, instinctively. His hand found hers in the dark, his fingers curling around her wrist, stopping her breath in her throat. For the first time since she had met him, his mask slipped. His grip was firm, his skin warm. But it wasn't restraint. It wasn't force. It was hesitation. A moment of weakness he hadn't meant to show. His jaw clenched, his expression unreadable again. But his grip didn't loosen. Ivy should have pulled away, but she didn't. The moment stretched, the air between them humming with something neither of them spoke aloud. Then, just as suddenly, he let go. "Go to bed, Ivy," he murmured, his voice rougher than before. But as she walked away, she knew she had won something tonight. A crack in the ice. The Blackwood estate had too many secrets. Ivy had known that from the moment she arrived, but she hadn't realized just how deep they ran. Until now. It started with the locked doors. She had noticed them from the beginning, lining the halls like sentinels, closed off and untouched. Some were ordinary, storage rooms, forgotten guest suites. But one, in particular, stood out. The door at the end of the east wing. It was different. Older. The wood slightly warped with time, but the brass handle polished, as if someone still touched it often. She had passed it a dozen times. But tonight, something compelled her to stop. A quick glance down the corridor. Empty. She reached for the handle, expecting resistance. But to her surprise, it turned. Unlocked. Ivy hesitated, pulse quickening, before stepping inside. The scent hit her first. Dust, aged paper, and something faintly floral, like faded perfume clinging to forgotten fabric. The room wasn't like the rest of the estate. It was untouched, frozen in time. A vanity stood against the wall, its mirror clouded with age. A delicate brush rested beside an open jewelry box. Dresses, their colors dulled by time, hung in a wardrobe that hadn't been opened in years. And on a small table near the window, a vase held the brittle remains of dried roses. It was a shrine to her, Helena Blackwood. Ivy's breath hitched. She stepped deeper into the room, fingers trailing over the dust-coated surfaces. This was her space, Silas's wife, the woman whose name haunted his nightmares. Then, something caught her eye. A locket, sitting alone on the vanity, as if waiting for someone to pick it up. Ivy reached for it carefully, her fingertips grazing the cool metal. The clasp was delicate but stubborn. When it finally popped open, she nearly dropped it. Inside was a small photograph. A woman with delicate features and dark eyes, frozen in time. But that wasn't what made Ivy's blood run cold. It was the other face in the locket. A girl. A child. Her. A sharp gasp escaped her lips. How? Why? The questions swarmed in her mind, unraveling everything she thought she knew. The door slammed shut. Ivy spun, her heart hammering. Silas stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burned with something she hadn't seen before. Panic. For the first time since meeting him, he wasn't composed. He wasn't cold and calculating. He looked afraid. His gaze flicked to the locket in her hand. His jaw tightened. Then, without a word, he strode forward and ripped it from her grasp. "You shouldn't be in here." His voice was low, but there was an edge of something else beneath it. Ivy swallowed hard, her mind still spinning. Why is my picture in there? Silas didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the door and slammed it shut, sealing the past behind it. The message was clear. This secret wasn't meant to be uncovered. But Ivy wasn't going to stop now. Ivy couldn't unsee the locket. It haunted her, even in silence. Even when Silas refused to speak of it, his reaction had told her more than words ever could. There was something he didn't want her to know, and she was determined to find out what. But the discovery had changed something between them. Silas had always been distant, unreadable. But now, he was different, restless, tense in a way that wasn't just cold detachment, but something deeper, something unraveling beneath the surface. He avoided her more than usual. When they crossed paths, he held himself stiffly, as if proximity alone was dangerous. His eyes lingered too long, filled with something restrained, something neither of them dared to name. And Ivy? She should have been afraid of him. She should have hated him. But against all reason, something about his presence pulled at her. Maybe it was the way his hands had trembled, just slightly, when he snatched the locket from her. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, like he was staring at a ghost he didn't know how to bury. Or maybe it was because, deep down, she could sense it. He was afraid of her. "You're playing with fire, Ivy." Jonathan's voice cut through her thoughts as she sat in the dimly lit library, absently running her fingers over the spine of a book she had no intention of reading. She glanced up to see him standing near the doorway, watching her carefully. "And fire burns." Ivy tilted her head. "So does ice." Jonathan sighed, stepping closer. "I know you think you're getting somewhere with him, but trust me, you're not. Silas Blackwood is not a man you can fix. He is what he is." Ivy met his gaze. "And what exactly is that?" Jonathan hesitated, then shook his head. "A man with too much to lose." She frowned. "Then why does it feel like he's already lost everything?" Jonathan didn't answer, and that was all she needed to know. The accident happened later that night. Ivy had gone to the balcony for fresh air, hoping the cold wind would help her clear her head. The estate was quiet, the moon casting silver light over the gardens below. She gripped the railing, lost in thought. Then, a sudden snap. The railing gave way. Her stomach lurched as she pitched forward, air rushing past her ears. A hand caught her wrist. The world tilted. She dangled above the drop, breath caught in her throat, as strong fingers tightened around her. She looked up. Silas. His expression was carved from stone, but his eyes were wild, burning with something fierce, something desperate. With one powerful motion, he pulled her back. They collapsed onto the floor of the balcony, breathless. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Ivy's heart thundered, not from fear, but from the way his grip still held her, as if letting go would be the worst thing in the world. She whispered, "That wasn't an accident, was it?" Silas exhaled sharply. "No." And just like that, the shadows around them grew darker. The atmosphere in the Blackwood estate had changed. Ivy could feel it in the way the air seemed heavier, thick with something unspoken. The near fall from the balcony wasn't an accident. Someone had wanted her dead, and that realization coiled around her spine like a warning. She wasn't safe here. Yet, despite everything, Silas had saved her. She found herself watching him more carefully now. He hadn't spoken about the incident, hadn't acknowledged the way his grip had lingered on her wrist long after he had pulled her back. But something about him was different, tighter, wary. Someone in the house was working against her. But who? The staff was small: Jonathan, the silent housekeeper, a handful of others who rarely spoke. None of them seemed out of place, but Ivy couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching her when she walked the halls. And then Victor Langley returned. Ivy stood at the edge of the drawing room, barely concealed by the heavy velvet drapes, as she listened to the low voices inside. Victor's presence was unmistakable. His voice carried the same smug confidence as before, but this time, there was something sharper in it. Curiosity, maybe even suspicion. "Tell me, Blackwood." Victor's tone was casual, but Ivy knew a threat when she heard one. Why go through all the trouble for her? Silas's response was clipped. "I don't owe you an explanation." Victor chuckled. "No? You think you can just take something off my table without consequence?" Ivy Calloway was already spoken for. A chill crawled down her spine. Spoken for? "She was never yours to claim," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. Victor was quiet for a beat. Then, "Neither was Helena. But that didn't stop you, did it?" Silas moved so fast Ivy barely had time to process it. There was the sound of something crashing, a chair scraping back, maybe a glass shattering. Victor exhaled sharply, but his tone remained smug. Touchy subject? A heavy pause. Then Silas spoke, and his voice was lethal. You will not come here again. Victor chuckled. You know how this works, Blackwood. Everyone pays their debts. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors as he left. Ivy barely had time to slip away before Silas stepped out of the room. She made it down the hall, heart racing. But before she could reach the stairs, his voice stopped her. Ivy. She turned slowly. Silas stood at the end of the corridor, watching her with that unreadable gaze. But this time, there was something harder in it. You don't leave the estate again. It wasn't a request. It was an order. And Ivy knew. Whatever was happening, whatever secrets lurked in Silas Blackwood's past, she was now tangled in them. Ivy sat on the edge of her bed, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her like a lead blanket. The puzzle pieces had been scattered for too long, fragments of a story she didn't fully understand. But now, finally, they were beginning to fit together. Silas hadn't bought her by accident. It had been intentional, deliberate. She had suspected it before, but after Victor's words, why go through all the trouble for her? And the way Silas had reacted, there was no denying it. He had known exactly who she was before that auction, which meant he had been lying to her from the beginning. Ivy had never been the kind of girl to sit quietly and accept her fate, so she didn't hesitate. She left her room, moving through the dimly lit halls with single-minded determination. The mansion was unnervingly silent, the air thick with the weight of something unspoken. She found Silas in his study. He stood near the window, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his gaze distant. The firelight flickered against the sharp angles of his face, casting shadows that made him look even more unreadable. Ivy stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. You knew my parents. Silas didn't turn. He took a slow sip of his drink before setting it down on the desk. Go to bed, Ivy. The dismissal only fueled her anger. Stop lying to me. This time, he did turn. His expression was controlled, but there was a flicker of something else beneath it, something darker. I never lied. His voice was calm, but it didn't match the tension in his posture. I just never told you the truth. Ivy's stomach twisted. Then tell me now. Silas exhaled, rubbing a hand along his jaw. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, finally, he spoke. I knew them. His voice was quiet, but the words struck like a hammer. A long time ago. Ivy's breath hitched. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't making excuses. She took a step closer, her hands clenched at her sides. What happened to them? Silas didn't answer. Ivy's pulse pounded. Tell me. His jaw tightened. Some truths kill, Ivy. Her throat tightened. So do lies. He didn't argue. He just looked at her, really looked at her, as if debating whether to say more, whether she was ready for whatever truth he held. Then, without another word, he turned away. And Ivy knew. Whatever he wasn't telling her, it was something that could destroy them both. Ivy sat in the dimly lit library, the weight of the past pressing against her chest like an iron cage. The fire crackled softly in the background, but the warmth didn't reach her. In her hands was the file Jonathan had slipped to her in secret, its contents shaking the very foundation of everything she thought she knew. Blackwood Enterprises. The name glared back at her from the faded case reports, intertwined with another horrifying word, accident. Her parents had died in a crash. That much she had always known. But what she hadn't known, what had been hidden, was that Blackwood Enterprises had been involved. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the reports. Faulty engineering, a cover-up, a quiet settlement, and at the bottom of the page, printed in ink that felt like a death sentence, Silas Blackwood, CEO. A cold wave of nausea rolled through her. It wasn't a coincidence. It had never been a coincidence. Silas hadn't bought her at that auction to protect her. He had taken her because he had owed a debt of blood and silence. Everything. Asterisk, asterisk, the warnings, the secrecy, the tension in his gaze when she asked too many questions. Asterisk, asterisk, it had all been leading to this. Ivy snapped the file shut. The room seemed smaller, the walls closing in. She had to get out. She found Silas in his study, where the scent of whiskey and smoke clung to the air like ghosts. He stood near the fireplace, back turned to her, as if he already knew she was coming. She didn't hesitate. The file hit the desk with a sharp thud. How long? Ivy's voice was quiet, but it carried through the room like a blade. Silas didn't turn. Ivy, how long have you known? She demanded, her throat burning. How long have you looked me in the eyes, knowing that your name is the reason my parents are dead? A slow exhale. He turned then, his face unreadable, but she could see it. The weight, the regret. Since the day I saw you, he admitted. The truth shattered something inside her. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped her lips. You really did buy me out of guilt. Silas's jaw tightened. I didn't want you to find out like this. Like this? Ivy's voice rose, raw with betrayal. There was never a right way to tell me, Silas. By the way, Ivy, I had a hand in destroying your family. Let's have dinner. Silas stepped forward, but she moved back. I never wanted to hurt you, he said, his voice lower now. I've been trying to protect you. She shook her head, rage and heartbreak colliding in her chest. Protect me? Or keep me from knowing the truth? Silas didn't answer, and that silence was more damning than anything he could have said. Her hand moved before she could stop herself. The slap echoed through the room. His head barely turned with the impact, but his shoulders stiffened. He didn't react. He didn't stop her when she took a step back, eyes burning with unshed tears. She turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to be as far away from him as possible. From the mansion, from its secrets, from him. But as she fled, her heart pounded with one terrifying realization. No matter how far she ran, she would never be able to outrun this. The cold night air bit into Ivy's skin as she ran. The Blackwood estate shrank behind her, its towering silhouette swallowed by the fog that crept over the trees. Her breath came fast, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. She didn't know where she was going. All she knew was that she needed to get away. From the lies. From the betrayal. From him. Branches clawed at her arms as she pushed deeper into the woods, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The gravel road leading down the mountain was too far. If she could just find a way down, someone, anyone, who could take her away from this nightmare. A crack of movement behind her. Ivy barely had time to react before rough hands grabbed her. A sharp gasp escaped her as she twisted, struggling, but the grip was too strong. A thick arm locked around her waist, a gloved hand covering her mouth before she could scream. Shoo! A voice murmured, amused. Not so fast, little thing. Victor Langley. Panic flooded through her. She fought harder, kicking, clawing at his arm, but another man grabbed her by the wrists. Silas shouldn't have interfered, Victor said smoothly, dragging her toward a waiting car parked near the road. You were promised to me, and I always collect what's mine. Ivy thrashed, her muffled screams useless in the thick night air. Then something changed. A new sound cut through the silence. The low, deadly rumble of an approaching car. Tires screeched against gravel. Headlights pierced through the darkness. Victor cursed. You have got to be kidding me. The black car came to a violent stop. The door flew open, and out stepped a man Ivy wasn't sure she wanted to see. But in that moment, she had never been more relieved. Silas. His coat billowed in the cold wind, his stance sharp and lethal. But his eyes were burning with something unforgiving. Let her go. Victor smirked, keeping a firm grip on Ivy's arm. You're really going to throw everything away for her? Silas didn't hesitate. Yes. The word was final. Victor sighed dramatically, shaking his head. You never learn, do you? He leaned close to Ivy's ear, voice soft enough that only she could hear. He doesn't know the whole truth, you know? A chill ran down Ivy's spine. But before she could ask what he meant, Silas moved. Fast. There was no warning, only a blur of motion before Silas slammed into Victor, sending him stumbling back. Ivy was yanked away, her balance faltering as Silas caught her. His arms wrapped around her, grounding her, his grip too tight, too desperate. Are you hurt? His voice was rough, urgent. She shook her head, still reeling, her mind spinning with Victor's words. Silas turned his attention back to Victor, pulling out a gun. Victor just laughed. "You think this ends tonight?" Silas didn't respond. He simply pulled the trigger, not at Victor, but at the tires of his car. The loud pop echoed through the trees, a final warning. Victor scowled but didn't push further. Instead, he straightened his jacket, smirking once more. "You can protect her for now, Blackwood. But one day, she'll find out what you're still hiding." With that, he disappeared into the night. Silas exhaled heavily. Then he turned to Ivy. "You're coming home." And this time, she didn't fight him, but her heart pounded with a different kind of fear. Because Victor Langley had just planted a seed of doubt. What didn't Silas know? The car ride back to the Blackwood estate was silent. Ivy sat rigid in the passenger seat, her mind a storm of emotions, her heart still racing from the night's events. The weight of Victor's words pressed against her chest. "He doesn't know the whole truth, you know." But right now, that wasn't the thought consuming her. It was him. Silas's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched as if he was holding himself together by sheer force of will. He hadn't said a word since pulling her away from Victor, but his presence, his proximity, was overwhelming. She should have still been furious with him. She should have been thinking about all the reasons she couldn't trust him, all the ways he had betrayed her. But she wasn't. She was thinking about the way his hands had trembled when they had found her, the way his voice had shaken when he asked if she was hurt, the way he had held her like she was something he couldn't afford to lose. The moment the car pulled into the long driveway, Ivy was the first to move. She shoved the door open, stepping into the cold night air, hoping the fresh wind would clear her thoughts. It didn't. The front door slammed behind them. "You shouldn't have run." Silas's voice was rough. Ivy spun to face him. "And you shouldn't have lied." His eyes darkened, but he didn't argue. The air between them crackled with something heavy, something undeniable. The firelight from the grand chandelier above flickered across his face, casting sharp shadows over his strong features. Ivy took a step forward before she could stop herself. "Why did you come for me, Silas?" His lips parted, but no words came. His hands flexed at his sides, as if he wanted to reach for her but was fighting the instinct. She swallowed hard. "I don't understand you." Silas exhaled sharply, running a hand over his jaw. His voice, when it came, was raw, exposed. "I should let you hate me." His throat bobbed. "But I can't." Ivy felt something break inside her. She should hate him. She wanted to hate him, but she couldn't. Not when he was looking at her like this. Not when he had risked everything to bring her back. Slowly, carefully, she closed the distance between them. "Then don't." Silas froze. His breath hitched, and then he gave in. His hands found her waist, pulling her closer, his touch hesitant yet desperate. She barely had time to breathe before his forehead rested against hers, his warmth seeping into her skin. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Because this, whatever this was between them, it shouldn't exist. And yet, neither of them could walk away. The mansion felt colder than ever. Ivy had spent the past day locked in her room, avoiding Silas, avoiding Jonathan, avoiding the weight of the truth pressing against her chest. But the silence wasn't protection. It was suffocating. She needed answers. The housekeeper had left a tray of untouched food outside her door. Jonathan had knocked once, but hadn't forced her to speak. And Silas had stayed away. Maybe he already knew that once she put the final pieces together, there would be nothing left to say. But the truth had a way of finding her anyway. She wasn't looking for it when she entered the library later that night, hoping the quiet would stop her thoughts from spiraling. But there it was, a file left open on the desk. Her eyes landed on the name first. Helena Blackwood. Her pulse pounded as she read. The deeper she went, the colder she became. Helena Blackwood, born Helena Calloway. Her breath caught. Her fingers trembled as she scanned the pages, her heart racing with a sinking dread. The date of birth. The parents listed. The undeniable proof. Helena had been her sister. And Silas had been married to her. The weight of it crashed down on her all at once. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just betrayal. It was impossible. The air rushed from her lungs as she shoved the papers away, backing up as if the truth itself could suffocate her. Footsteps sounded in the hall, and before she could process what she was doing, she turned, straight into Silas. His hands instinctively steadied her, his grip firm, warm, familiar. But now, all she felt was cold. Ivy. His voice was low, cautious. He saw the look on her face. He knew. She yanked away from him. You knew. The accusation came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't care. You knew this whole time, didn't you? Silas's jaw tightened. I was trying to protect you. A bitter laugh broke from her throat. Protect me? She gestured wildly to the file on the desk. You should have told me. Instead, you let me. She cut herself off, her chest heaving. She couldn't say it. She couldn't put words to what had been happening between them, to the tension, the moments, the feeling that had been building between them since the beginning. Silas stepped closer. Ivy, listen to me. No. She shook her head, blinking back tears. No, you don't get to explain this away. She wanted to push him, hurt him, make him feel even a fraction of what she was feeling. Instead, she did the only thing her body knew how to do. She ran. Away from him. Away from the mansion. Away from everything that had just shattered inside her. The storm outside matched the chaos inside Ivy. She ran blindly through the cold night, the rain slicing against her skin as she forced herself forward, away from the Blackwood estate, away from him. Her heart pounded in her ears, louder than the wind howling through the trees. The weight of the truth pressed down on her, suffocating. Helena was her sister. Silas had been her husband. Everything between them, the tension, the fire, the undeniable pull, was a mistake. It had to be, but no matter how far she ran, she couldn't outrun the truth, nor the memory of Silas's eyes when she had confronted him. Pain, regret, something devastating, but she wouldn't let herself believe in it. She couldn't. The sharp beam of headlights cut through the trees ahead. Ivy barely had time to react before a black SUV skidded to a stop on the gravel road. Her body tensed. Not now. Not here. The door swung open, and her stomach dropped. Victor Langley. He stepped out, his expression unreadable beneath the flickering glow of the headlights. His suit, usually pristine, was damp from the rain, but he didn't seem to care. You just can't stop running, can you? His voice was almost amused. Almost. Ivy took a step back. Stay away from me. Victor sighed. You're exhausting, really. So much trouble for one girl. He tilted his head. But I suppose I should thank you. You running straight into me makes this much easier. She moved to turn. Too late. The second man appeared from the shadows, grabbing her arm, yanking her back before she could fight. Let go of me, she screamed, struggling. But Victor only watched, unfazed. You made this more complicated than it needed to be, he mused. Blackwood should have handed you over when he had the chance. But now? He pulled a gun from his coat, tilting it idly in his hand. Now, I don't need you alive. Ivy's blood ran cold. This was it. Victor raised the gun. Then, a gunshot. A blur of movement. Something slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. Pain never came, but the sound of a sharp breath did. Ivy's body hit the wet gravel with force, but before she could process what had happened, she saw him. Silas. He was on top of her, shielding her. But something was wrong. He wasn't moving. For a moment, she thought time had stopped. Then, the blood. It spread against his white shirt, staining the fabric dark. A slow, terrible realization dawned as the rain mixed with the crimson seeping from his chest. He had taken the bullet meant for her. No, 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 no. Ivy's hands pressed against the wound, desperately trying to stop the bleeding. Silas made a sound, a rough, pained exhale. Victor cursed, stepping back. The second man hesitated, clearly thrown off by what had just happened. Silas lifted his head slightly, just enough to look at Victor. Even bleeding, even barely able to breathe. His expression was pure rage. Run, he gritted out, his voice sharp as glass. Before I kill you. Victor hesitated. But then the sound of approaching engines filled the air. Jonathan. Security. Help. Victor scowled, muttering a curse, then turned and disappeared into the night, his men following. Ivy didn't care. Her entire world had narrowed to the man in her arms. Silas, stay with me. Please. His breaths were shallow, his skin too pale. Rain dripped down his face, mixing with the blood, but his eyes, found hers. Something in them softened. His hand, shaking, reached for her. Fingers brushed against her cheek, smearing a streak of red. I never wanted redemption, he whispered, voice so weak she barely heard it. Her throat clenched. Don't say that. His lips parted slightly, the ghost of a smile forming. Only you. Then his body went limp. Silas. Ivy's scream was swallowed by the storm. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and death. Ivy sat motionless in the waiting area, her clothes damp with rain and streaked with Silas's blood. It had dried on her hands, beneath her nails, no matter how many times she rubbed them together. The doctors had taken him from her the moment they arrived, his body limp, his breath shallow. Jonathan had pulled her back, whispering words of reassurance, but Ivy barely heard him. The only thing she could hear was Silas's last whisper before he lost consciousness. Only you. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the words wouldn't leave her. How had she gotten here? How had a man she once despised become the only thing in the world she couldn't bear to lose? Jonathan sat beside her, but he didn't speak. The silence between them was thick with unspoken fears. He had been the one to drive them here, his usual calm unraveling with every minute that passed. Finally, he exhaled. He's strong, Ivy. She didn't look at him. I know, but even strong men could die. The doors to the emergency ward swung open, and a doctor approached, still dressed in bloodied scrubs. Ivy shot to her feet before he even spoke. He's alive, the doctor said, but his face was grim. The bullet punctured a lung. We stopped the bleeding, but he's not out of danger yet. The world tilted slightly. Jonathan put a steadying hand on her back, but she barely registered it. Alive. The word rang in her head like a fragile promise. Can I see him? The doctor hesitated, then nodded. Just for a moment. He's still unconscious. That was enough. The room was eerily quiet. Machines beeped in slow, steady rhythms, monitoring the fragile balance between life and death. Silas lay on the hospital bed, his face pale, his breathing shallow. Wires ran from his chest, and 4 in his arm, bandages stark against his skin. He looked smaller like this, stripped of his usual power, his control. Ivy moved to his side, sinking into the chair beside the bed. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, brushing against his hand. The warmth there was barely noticeable, but it was enough. You saved me, she whispered. She had spent so much time fighting him, pushing him away, drowning in what they weren't supposed to be. But none of that mattered now. The past didn't matter. Her mother's face, blurred by time. Her father's laugh, long forgotten. Helena's name, carved into the walls of her memories. They had all been part of a life she could never get back. But this man, this broken, complicated, impossible man, was here. And she loved him. She loved him in a way that terrified her, in a way she hadn't wanted to admit, in a way that had already rewritten her fate. Her grip on his hand tightened. Don't you dare leave me, Silas Blackwood. She didn't leave his side. Not that night. Not ever. Silas stirred for the first time in 2 days. Ivy sat up instantly, her breath catching as his fingers twitched against the sheets. The steady beeping of the monitors filled the sterile hospital room, but it was the slight furrow of his brows, the uneven breath pushing past his lips, that sent a rush of relief through her. He was waking up. She leaned forward, gripping his hand. Silas. His eyelids fluttered. Then, slowly, his gaze met hers. It took a moment for recognition to settle in his dark eyes. His lips parted, a breath of a word escaping. Ivy. A lump formed in her throat. She had spent the past 48 hours in that chair, refusing to leave, refusing to let go of his hand, refusing to let fate take him away from her. And now, Here he was, alive. "You're an idiot," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. A slow exhale left him. "I've been told." Relief hit her so hard that she wanted to shake him, kiss him, scream at him all at once. But instead, she just tightened her grip on his fingers. Silas swallowed, his throat dry. His gaze flickered around the room, taking in the wires still attached to his body. Then his expression turned unreadable. "You should leave." Ivy blinked, the words slicing through the warmth of the moment. "What?" He exhaled, shifting slightly in the bed, his face tightening from the effort. "You've been given a way out, Ivy. Victor's gone. You're free." The words should have meant something. They should have given her relief. But instead, they made her want to scream. She pulled back slightly, eyes burning. "Is that what you think I want? To leave?" Silas didn't answer. His gaze dropped, his fingers curling slightly against the sheets. Ivy inhaled sharply. "You're trying to let me go." His jaw clenched. "It's what's best for you. Don't do that," she snapped, her heart hammering. "Don't act like you get to decide that for me." His eyes darkened. After everything, I should have run a long time ago. But I didn't." She leaned closer, voice steady, final. "Because I don't want to." Silas stared at her, something breaking in his expression. Ivy exhaled softly, her fingers reaching up to touch his face. Light, hesitant. "No more running," she whispered. "We belong to each other." For the first time, he didn't argue. The storm had passed, but the echoes of it remained. Ivy sat in the hospital room's dim glow, her fingers intertwined with Silas's, grounding herself in his warmth. He was stronger now, his skin no longer deathly pale, his breathing steadier. But there was something else in his eyes, something lighter, as if the weight of his past was finally beginning to lift. Then the door opened. Jonathan stepped inside, his usual composed expression tinged with something different, finality. He adjusted his cufflinks, then met Silas's gaze. "It's done." Silas exhaled, tension slowly draining from his shoulders. "Victor?" Jonathan gave a curt nod. "He won't be a problem anymore." Ivy studied him carefully. "What does that mean?" Jonathan hesitated, but only for a second. "It means you're safe. Both of you." His tone was even, but the implication was clear. Victor Langley was gone. The relief that washed over Ivy was immediate, but not without unease. She didn't ask how Jonathan had ensured it. Didn't want to know. Silas, however, was unfazed. He simply gave a slow nod. "Thank you." Jonathan sighed, rolling his shoulders back. "Don't thank me yet. You still have one final decision to make." His gaze flickered between them. "Are you staying? Or are you finally getting out of that damn house?" Silas's fingers tightened around Ivy's. She met his gaze, already knowing her answer. They were leaving. 2 days later, Ivy stood at the base of the Blackwood Estate's grand staircase, staring up at the place that had once felt like a prison. She had spent nights wandering these halls, searching for answers in locked rooms, feeling trapped by things she hadn't understood. But now, the doors no longer felt like barriers. Because she wasn't a prisoner anymore. Silas appeared beside her, his coat draped over his arm, his movements slower than usual but steady. His injuries were still healing, but there was life in his eyes again. She looked up at him. "Ready?" He didn't hesitate.
Yes.
They stepped outside together, the cold morning air wrapping around them as the car waited at the edge of the driveway. Ivy exhaled, staring at the towering mansion behind them one last time. It had been a place of secrets, of pain, but it had also led her to him. And now, they were walking away from it, together. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like a beginning. A gentle hush had settled around the remote cabin, as if the world itself had paused to catch its breath. The last strains of twilight disappeared behind the pine trees, leaving the windows aglow with the soft, warm light of the fireplace inside. Ivy stood near the kitchen counter, absently running her thumb along the rim of a steaming mug of tea. She could still hardly believe it. The quiet, the safety, and most of all, the sensation of finally having choices of her own. The cabin was nothing like the grand Blackwood mansion. Here, There were no looming portraits or locked doors. Instead, it was small and cozy, its walls lined with simple shelves, each one filled with just enough to make it feel lived in. She'd always imagined that freedom would look like an endless road, but somehow, it felt even better to be here, wrapped in four walls that held no secrets, only the promise of a new start. From behind her, she heard the steady tread of footsteps on the wooden floor. Silas. She turned slowly, heart fluttering the way it always did when she sensed him. He was dressed in comfortable clothes, his hair still slightly damp from the evening air. There was a slight limp in his step, a reminder of the bullet wound that had almost taken him from her, but he never complained about the pain. Despite everything they had been through, something in his eyes now looked lighter. The endless burden he used to carry across his shoulders had lessened, replaced by cautious hope. His gaze found hers, and a flicker of warmth passed between them, like the rekindling of an old fire. "I thought you might want something to eat," he said, his voice low and carefully controlled, as though still uncertain if he had the right to be domestic, to care for her in such ordinary ways. Ivy offered a small smile. "Thank you. I appreciate it." A brief silence followed, thick with the weight of all that had remained unspoken. They had confessed love in moments of crisis, survived the nightmares that had nearly consumed them. Yet standing here, in this quiet cabin, the closeness felt both new and profound. She took a step closer, setting her mug aside. Her heart pounded with an anticipation that came not from fear, but from a tenderness she was only beginning to understand. He watched her carefully, as if gauging her every movement, unsure whether she wanted him near. But she did. Reaching out, Ivy gently laced her fingers with his. She felt the warmth of his skin, the faint tremble in his hand, a reminder that for all his power, he was still a man who had nearly lost everything. In many ways, they both had. Silas inhaled, closing his eyes as if the moment itself was something he needed to memorize. Then, carefully, he placed his free hand on her waist, guiding her closer until there was no space between them. A log in the fireplace popped, sending sparks dancing in the air. The soft glow illuminated Silas's face, highlighting the faint lines of pain near his temple and the subtle scar that curved across his brow. Ivy's gaze lingered there, remembering the first time she'd noticed it, and how it symbolized the many battles he'd fought, both outside and within. "Ivy," he whispered, voice tinged with vulnerability. She lifted her hand, letting her fingertips trace the outline of his jaw. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured, her tone just as soft. "I know." He exhaled, almost like a silent surrender. In the past, he'd been the closed door, the unyielding fortress. Now, he was simply Silas, human, flawed, and deeply, unmistakably hers. With deliberate care, he leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers. The moment was still, each breath shared between them. Ivy felt tears prick at the back of her eyes, memories of loss and grief flooding in. But this time, she let them blend with a hope she hadn't dared to feel in far too long. They stood like that for a heartbeat, then two, until at last he bent, capturing her lips in a gentle, lingering kiss. There was no urgency, only the profound relief of two souls finding each other in the aftermath of countless storms. When they parted, Ivy looked up at him, swallowing the lump in her throat. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "We suffered enough. Let's live now." For a moment, he said nothing. His dark eyes searched hers, and a slow, hesitant smile curved his lips, perhaps the first genuine smile she had ever seen on him. It was like watching light stream into a room that had been locked away for years. "With you?" Silas asked, voice thick with emotion. "Always." They sank onto the worn sofa near the fire, Ivy curled against his chest, the sound of his heartbeat steady and reassuring under her ear. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines, but it felt distant, like a memory from another life. In that moment, there was only the two of them, each wound and scar a testament to the trials they'd survived. Ivy's eyelids grew heavy with comfort as Silas pressed a gentle kiss to her hair. The fire crackled on, its warmth dancing across their intertwined hands. Maybe the future was still uncertain, but it didn't matter. They would face it together. In the end, love wasn't about being perfect. It was about surviving together.